Hi, Jonathan. Lovely to see you there. You're very well lit. And I guess my first question is, how does it feel to be a disembodied head floating above your audience? Would you consider that very Meadsian, or is it more of a Cronenberg gag?
It's becoming kind of a practical necessity at the moment, it appears.
I see, okay. Well, we've just rewatched The Joy of Essex. When was the last time you rewatched it, and what things do you pull out when you re-see it? Are there, sort of technical points or things that you would see from the other side of the camera that strike you or bug you?
I have an acquaintance who in the 1980s directed a program called Howard's Way, which was kind of yachty schlock. And I went to lunch at his house once, and his wife said, oh, he's upstairs in his study. And I went up to his study, and there he was watching 10-year-old episodes of Howard's Way. And I thought this was a good, this is a lesson here. Just don't watch your own stuff. Get on to the next thing. So I tend not to go through my back pages.
Right, so you didn't watch it in preparation for any of this?
I mean, on the occasions...
Just freestyling, yeah?
Sorry?
You're just freestyling then? You know what it's all about?
Yes, I mean, I can remember, one gets immersed in these things, and you remember them pretty well. I mean, whenever you do see your stuff again, you think, oh Christ, that should not have been like that, we should have done it this way, or, why has so much time been given to this? There are always faults you can find, and one could go on forever picking at pieces. But basically, you're doing a job, you've got a deadline, more importantly, you've got an extremely limited budget, so you often can't repair things even when you have noticed them when you're still in the cutting room.
What was the impetus behind making this film? Was it to make a film about Essex as a county, or did the idea of sort of communitarianism and these sort of utopias come first? No, it was two things. One, the dangerous socialist Simon Heffer remarked to me that I ought to make a film on Essex, and secondly, well, he was partly prompted by the fact that he knew that I knew Essex very well. I had a girlfriend who came from between Whittam and Malden, who I lived with all through the 70s, and so I got to know Essex pretty well in those days, and there was that. There was the Essex which I knew, and the Essex which Simon knows. And on the other hand, there was this monstrous county of fake tans and celebs and people who are famous for being famous and seem generally kind of fairly violent and rather unpleasant. I thought it was a great pity that this sort of etiquette should attach to a county which actually I find to be very special. I mean, I think the Essex shore from, say, the Dartford Bridge up to Walton on the Naze and the Walton backwaters, Hamford waters and so on, is a tremendous, I was going to say landscape. It's not a landscape, it's a land and seascape. And it's got something very, very special about it. There isn't anywhere else really like it in England. The other side of the estuary is equally interesting, the North Kent, but it's of a completely different character. It does have magnificent estuary, the Medway, but it doesn't have the creeks in quite the way that Essex does. I'm also very fond of hulks and rotting boats, and it's very good if that happens to be your dada. See. So whose idea was the DJ?
Mine.
I see. And I mean, it just picks up on a very. I guess it takes the Partridge thing slightly more seriously than the Partridge ever takes it. It's genuinely part of that. The closing line of the film talks about a sump of eternal Dreibergs, referring, I assume, to Tom Dreiberg, who's mentioned earlier. It's a very gnomic closing point you're making there.
Well, I used the word swallow.
Yeah.
And there was nothing that Uncle Tom liked more than to swallow someone else's sperm. And he was very well known for it. In fact, Francis Wheen, in his magnificent biography of Dreiberg, actually invented a word for it, which was spermophagus. Add to your word power.
Yeah. I mean, Dreiberg's a man who's kind of receded into the pages of history, though. I mean, I don't know if people under 50 would necessarily know who he was. Why does he hold a particular, I don't know, affection, animosity to you?
No animosity at all. I mean, I was very fascinated by people like that. I mean, I think one doesn't get people in public life like that any longer who are so manifestly politically incorrect and over the top. And I think it's a great loss that one is, you know, the world is full of people like Philip Hammond, who I imagine doesn't swallow other men.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you say that because Dreiberg's seat is now claimed by John, what was his name, who was the culture secretary, Whittingdale, until recently, who exhibited some of the same tendencies. He went out with a woman who was later found to be an escort,
but in a rather banal way.
Yeah.
I thought it was a pretty banal show, and he doesn't have the kind of chutzpah to go with it. Whittingdale was.
Okay.
I mean, there was a wonderful moment which Wheen recounts about Dreiberg taking Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull to dinner with W.H. Auden. Jagger didn't turn up, and Auden looked across the table to Marianne Faithfull and said, "Tell me, when you're smuggling drugs, do you pack them up your arse?" And these were actually very Essex people. I mean, not Auden, but Francis Bacon had a house at Wivenhoe. Dickie Chopping had a house there. There was an extraordinary sort of ménage, God knows how many, 7 or 8, run by, among others, Maurice Cowling. There was a degree of libertinism which has now been lost. Perhaps we can move on to something like Dinky Toys.
Yeah, that's very sad. Whenever you talk about sort of communitarianism in your films and these kinds of alternative communities, you know, there's a certain down-the-nose quality to it. I don't know if that's just how you talk or whatever, but, you know, I would just wonder whether you ever feel any need, desire to dissolve yourself within a greater community, whether that idea has ever had any merit appeal to you.
No, I'm kind of one of those solitary loners who goes and shoots up shopping malls.
Yes.
No, communitarian life has always struck me as being rather hellish, and I got a very, very small dose of it in my late teens and early 20s, and that was quite enough. I think that if I look, I don't think I do look down my nose at it. I'm extremely interested in it. I'm sort of very fascinated by such books as Gillian Darley's Village's Vision and Utopia Britannica online. But the thing is that you know they're all going to fail. They you know, it's a form of demographic joining which simply never comes off. Even if the community itself builds, you know, something special which is bespoke to it, it always fails. I mean, anti-hierarchy doesn't really work. And that's the crux of it.
What was your experience?
But that's no reason not to try.
Yeah?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
What was your experience of communitarianism in your late teens, early 20s? How close did you get?
Well, I and my then girlfriend shared a flat with two people, one of whom was never there. And
yes.
So odd bods used to sort of, when it was a huge, huge flat. I mean, it had 12 rooms and was rent controlled. And people used to turn up, and we never knew how to get rid of them. On one occasion, we got a friend round who took an instant dislike to this guy who'd imposed himself on us. And we were sitting down having some sort of supper. And suddenly there was a scream, and this friend of ours had bitten this guy in the thigh. So he left. On another occasion, we got the same friend round to remove some vegetarians who weren't just vegetarians, they were proselytizing vegans. And this friend, who I shall name as Dusty Hughes, the playwright and scriptwriter, had this great idea of going to the fridge and getting a piece of liver and sticking it into his flies and just walking into the room which they'd taken over. And they moved out very quickly. So you can counter communitarianism. Quite easily done.
It's a battle we should all be fighting, I suppose, yeah. Is there, I mean, yeah, when we look at men like Barter and Crittall, there was a golden age of those kinds of sort of, work-based, the factory, and the happy worker is the productive worker, whereas nowadays, the maximum model for productivity seems to be the Sports Direct model. We've definitely passed that golden age of you keep your workers on site. But would you see any kind of parallel, I don't know, with maybe the software industry, that sort of tech hub, Apple's Infinity Loop or anything like that? Is there still a role for the worker bees to be happy in their productivity?
I don't think, from what I've read about Apple and Microsoft and the other sort of Californian giants, that there is much desire to make your workers happy. It's much more like, going back to some kind of behaviorism, carrot and stick, and I really think it's quite sinister. I don't think there's anything particularly sinister about Barter or about Crittall, save that you just had to join in with everything, which for someone like me would have been a kind of hell on earth. But I'm sure they probably do exist in a kind of very small way on landed estates still. But the factory working like that, Port Sunlight, Accroydon, Saltaire, etc. They've all gone their different ways. Cadbury, and so on. I mean, it was done in the very best intentions. I mean, most of the families which established those sort of villages were Quakers. I mean, there's some extraordinary link between Quakers and chocolates. I don't quite know what it is. It was done in good faith, and it worked for a fairly long time.
One of the favourite facts that I turfed up in researching this is that after Barter died in a plane crash, his brother took over the company and then installed his office inside the lift in the 21-storey head office in the Czech Republic, it was in Czechoslovakia, and was at travel between floors, sitting behind his desk, working along, and then managing as he went at each floor. I mean, do you think that could be replicated by today's software tech giant CEOs? Is that a neat touch?
Well, of course it could be replicated, but I mean, would you want to replicate it? That's the question. But on the other hand, yes, I mean, CEOs who are in more direct contact with their workers, probably a good idea. I don't know anything about this. I've never worked in a factory or an office.
One of the best lines in the whole thing is probably when you talk about Poundbury being a Thomas Hardy theme park for slow learners. I mean, I guess what we've got with the present housing crisis is a role for the state, a role for privateers, which you're going to get onto at the very end of your film in another sense, with a Cockney Shangri-La angle, and then I guess a role for corporate elements within that. What do you think, given the amount of building we're going to have to do over the next 10 years, is the best balance between those three and or any more?
Well, I'm not sure what the three are. I mean, I certainly think the kind of Poundbury, new urbanism, seaside solution is not a solution. It already looks terribly dated. Poundbury is a particularly bad offender because it ruins the view of Maiden Castle, which is one of the greatest earthworks in Europe. What were the other two?
The other two were the sort of corporatism of Barter et al., or that thing, and the sort of private.
But what do you mean by
building.
What do you mean by corporatism?
Just the idea of corporations coming in to put down plots on that.
Yeah, but they might come in and they might build sort of folksy Poundbury stuff, or they might build rational sort of neo-60s buildings. It's who builds it doesn't really determine how it's built.
Okay. What do you remember from the making of The Joy of Essex in terms of going out to film it? I gather you are given about half as many days to make these things now as you were a decade or more ago due to BBC cuts. It feels like a very intense process now.
Well, it is very intense. Frank Hanley describes it as being, once described it as, we used to be a convoy, now we're one smart car. The main thing one remembers is being, of all of these shoots, is just being incredibly tired.
Yeah.
Of kind of, you start at 8 in the morning, you finish at about 8 o'clock, you have something to eat and drink, and then you crash out, and that's it. I mean, we're not like Led Zeppelin. We don't have an airplane full of groupies.
It's sad, very sad. What is the state of your relationship with the BBC nowadays, and how do you see its commitment to the type of documentaries that you make, and that, I guess, high art programming? I mean, would you say it's going downhill, more downhill, or as downhill as it ever has been?
I think it's going downhill. I don't think it's a sort of type of program I make. There's no one else doing the same sort of thing. The nearest person, I suppose, is Adam Curtis, but he doesn't get much pecuniary favour from the BBC either. It's certainly, I mean, I'll do a couple more and then I think I'll throw in the towel.
Yeah. Are there any couple more that you feel you'd like to do? Where are you going next?
Well, I'm working on two programs at the moment. Whether they'll come off or not, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But I feel a kind of slight aggrievement that virtually moronic footballers get paid huge sums for saying he nodded it in the back of the net and it's only banter. Whereas people like me who can actually do something are regarded as poor relations.
How are you
I'm actually not that bitter about it. I suppose I should be really bitter and kind of, the Tuggies' silent handkerchief.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're an enormously magnanimous man, I guess, in that sense. But this festival is about Essex and the rebranding of Essex in some sense, and that's a horrible term, placemaking. If you were the marketing manager of Essex, what would you recommend they do to jazz up their image?
God, I would have thought the thing you need to do is get them to jazz down their image.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't like the idea of branding and so on at all. I don't like tourist boards, which are simply a dishonest form of PR. Well, all PR is dishonest, but it's a particularly dishonest one. I think leave alone. Don't mess with things unless they're broken. And Essex isn't broken. I mean, holds huge appeal for me, and I imagine for hundreds of thousands of others. And it doesn't need to have a kind of some sort of cosmetic spray applied to it. I'm happy with it as it is, but then I really dislike that idea of crap towns. I don't think there is such a thing as a crap town. I think everywhere's interesting, everywhere's fascinating if you bother to explore it and exhibit a kind of curiosity towards it and make yourself find it fascinating. So I like leaving things alone. I mean, on a more serious note, I would like to see a moratorium on building in Britain. Building in Britain, I think, has got out of hand. And lots of, awful bling blocks of towers, which are not any use for the current population of Britain, who can't afford them. I'd like to see, decently done social housing of the kind that, say, Camden did in the late 60s and early 70s, done everywhere, and done cheaply and responsibly and sustainably. I hate using the word sustainable, but it needs to be sustainable. But that's what should happen in Essex, and it's what should happen everywhere. And, the oligarchs, they can come here if they want. They don't come here because they know they're going to get robbed.
Right. So, I mean, even if you were given a lit match and told you can burn down one bit of Essex and no questions asked, you would not light the taper on Basildon Town Centre? I don't know. What would take your fancy?
I wouldn't burn down anywhere in Essex. I'd burn down quite a lot of the city of London.
Right. Where would you start there?
City of London. Anywhere.
Just
I'm a very promiscuous pyromaniac.
I see. I guess there is that, that London thing. I think you said to me on another occasion that it's beginning to look like downtown St. Louis or something like that. There is a sense that London is becoming swamped by its own sheer anonymity of the stuff they're throwing up now.
Well, there is that thing that people proudly say, London is getting to look like Dubai or Qatar or something. But it's not. It's getting to look like Tulsa or Colorado or, I don't know, Sioux Falls. I mean, it doesn't look grand. And there's when you come into London from Essex across Rainham Marches, you see what a tiny proportion of London is actually high-rise and how ill it accords with the rest of London. London has been a predominantly low-rise megalopolis for many, many centuries, and doing what is being done to it at the moment detracts from it.
There is a man whose job it is to sculpt that particular patch of skyline down by, sort of centred around the Gherkin and Tower 42. It works for City Hall. He would argue it's a bit of a work in progress, that give it 10 years, give 15 years.
But it's always a work in progress. I mean, the Elizabeth line is a work in progress. Well, no, it's never going to be finished. It's an interminable building site. There is no end to it. And that is what one has to face if one lives there. I mean, I'm very glad not to live there any longer, but partly because of that. I mean, where I lived, just around the corner from where they were about to start building the Shard, it turned into a sort of hauliers convention.
It still is. Are you? You're at the Unité d'Habitation right now, are you?
Yeah.
Yeah. What could we see behind you? Is that your balcony?
No, you can't really see
much.
I'm not quite sure. You just see a sort of vague view of the western side of the building.
I see. Marvellous. Would you like to take some questions from the floor? There are some people out here who I've been told might have some questions for you.
Yeah, sure.
Sling them over. Okay. Can we have some questions from the floor? I believe there is a roving mic, so someone's going to rove, and you should be able to hear them with a little bit of luck.
Hello. One of the things that you may have found in your research for the Essex programme was when these estates and developments were built, did they give any consideration that we do nowadays to the actual livability, the maintenance and so forth and upkeep of the homes?
In a word, no. I mean, the plot lands in Leindon, Basildon, Pitsea, Jaywick, etc., frequently didn't have services at all. And there was not an infrastructure, there weren't tarmac roads to them. So it was a pretty kind of wild east way of living.
Anyone else got a question? For Jonathan? Oh, there we go, up front.
I just wanted to ask about Utopias. So I think the entire programme is probably about, as you said before, Utopias don't work. Do you think anybody will do Utopias again? Or do you think it's a dead idea for centuries?
No, I think they will. I think it goes on and on and on. And I don't think one should castigate anyone for trying. Better to try and fail than, not try at all. But they will reappear in, I suppose, different forms. And there's every hope, I would have thought, that they could be more successful now, because technology, whatever else technology has done, it has diminished in size. It's portable, it's usable in a different way. I mean, we have phones now which can do what 50 years ago an entire room in a bungalow could do.
Towards the end of the film, you seem to be talking quite positively about the do-it-yourself style landscapes or townscapes, as opposed to the more planned communities that you talk about in the sort of first 3/4 of the film. Is that a model that you do think is worth investigating more or continuing or continuing to do? As opposed to what you were talking about in terms of let's do Camden Council style estates everywhere.
Well, people have tried to build for wilderness and inconstancy and so on, and it seems never to have come off, or doesn't come off in a big way. But again, there is no point in eschewing it as an idea because it's failed in the past. But the attraction of towns, cities, conglomerations and so on is largely, I would say, to do with the fact that they are various, that they move in material, scale and use over a few hundred yards. You don't get this in Paris particularly, because Paris is homogeneous. But in most Western cities, you do get this clash of scale and use all over the place, which is actually, I think, what makes them attractive. It's very difficult to plan for that, though.
Because you've been a fan of containers and porta cabins and using those kind of very temporary bits and pieces in a more permanent way as one method of changing our landscape, of building in a more interesting and diverse way, which is obviously kind of parallels the plot lands of the Essex coast and your other film on plot lands. I mean, how much of a solution is that? It's a lovely idea, and it sort of chimes with a lot of your sort of libertarian, anarcho-syndicalist ideals, but how actually practicable is that on a more mass scale?
I think it's very practical. I mean, containers are not expensive. They are also extremely flexible. They can be conjoined in all sorts of different manners. The best example of this that I know is in Rotterdam Harbour, which is on a massive scale. But we've also got some smaller, at Leamouth, there's some rehearsal rooms just opposite on the north of the river where the dome is. And people have not been allowed to live in them, but I don't really see why not. I mean, you can join them up to the sewers and services easily enough. There's no problem. It strikes me a wonderful, wonderful way of building straightforward homes for people who are unfortunate enough not to have such a thing.
That seems to be part of your vision, this kind of human honeycomb thing, this idea that, I guess it's just parallel to what you were just saying about the joy of cities being in the sheer diversity of landscapes and people fitting themselves in a very individual way.
Well, yes, I mean, and people do fit themselves in all sorts of ways, but I mean, the thing is with containers, you can put containers on tops of other buildings. We should build up from what's there already, not, sort of...
Yeah.
Not find a plot which is pure. I mean, the best things never really are pure. They're always contaminated by what's been there before, or so on. And I think containers is a fantastic opportunity.
Just knock them on top of things. Anyone else got a question?
You spoke earlier about sort of all these luxury flats being a big problem, but mic up a bit higher. Okay. But the other sort of problem I've been noticing is in England, as much as in France we're living right now, is these huge sort of sprawling estates that the volume builders seem to be building. Is there a way around that to build suburbia in a new and better way?
Well, I don't think you need to rebuild suburbia. You need to maintain what's there already. The same thing happened in France as happened in Britain, that people built vast megastructures and then completely forgot to maintain them. I mean, you don't buy a car and not take it to the garage. It's as simple as that. But I mean, the people who were decanted, and that's a word that was used a lot, decanted into these apartment blocks, were given no protection. There were no guardians. There were no whatever you call them, concierge. People could just walk in, piss in the lift, deal drugs in the lift. I mean, you've got to have a certain amount of defensible space, and they didn't get it. But there's actually nothing wrong with the buildings themselves for the most part. Sure, in some of them there was too much asbestos. Sure, they used some very dodgy systems like clasp. But usually they were okay. And you look at places like thing on Erno Goldfinger's thing, Trellick Tower. That is now hugely desirable property because it's been properly maintained. And there are dozens like that around the place, not just in London, or in all of the big cities, and small cities as well, actually.
I just wanted to hear some of your thoughts on how a county that seemingly was a hotbed of collectivist and utopian projects also became the county that spawned that figure, Essex Man, the city commuting, white van driving, occasionally racist yuppie figure.
Well, all sorts of people coexist in all sorts of situations, I think. I mean, you could probably have found Hertfordshire Man, or Surrey Man, or Middlesex Man. I mean, I very much doubt whether the creature called Essex Man is exclusive to Essex. It's perhaps just a bit more noticeable there. But I think that in any area you're going to find a fairly considerable mix, apart from those areas in which there have been class clearances, like great chunks of central London now, where there is no one apart from the very rich.
We're just moving the mic around, and there we go.
Hi, Jonathan. My name's Gary. I grew up in South Yorkshire, a town called Doncaster, which was industrial-based growth during the last century. Since lived in Essex for many years, I just wondered what you thought about the likes of Bourneville and Rowntree, and also here, where we are today. I wondered, these businessmen, capitalists had a social responsibility to their workers. I wondered what you thought about the likes of Google and Amazon having a social responsibility towards their workers, and how the governments of today could impose that sort of thing on them.
I don't think Google and Amazon are persuadable. And I don't think governments today would be likely to want to persuade them. The thing is that with the socialist government of Attlee, 1945, it's almost as if the government took over the idea of noblesse oblige, took over the idea of the aristocrats' responsibility to the poor. And those governments were mostly composed of a particular kind of public school boy who'd worked at missions in the, like Toynbee mission in the East End. And they were imbued with a sense of social responsibility. And that continued through what became known as the 13 years of Tory misrule to 1964, when Harold Wilson got in, and it continued. But then as soon as Mrs. Thatcher got in, Mrs. Thatcher wasn't a Tory of any kind, she was a Manchester Liberal. And I find one of the most telling things about Thatcher is the sort of peculiar alliance between Thatcher and people like Branson, who doesn't seem to have any idea of responsibility towards his workers. The workers are sort of, so-called interns. And there's got to be what James Callaghan called a sea change in attitudes towards workers, but before anything happens. And I don't really see it happening, regrettably.
I'm inclined to agree with you. I grew up, my parents instilled in me a real hatred for Margaret Thatcher, and obviously seeing the demise of the industry that grew a great society that I grew up in my childhood, I felt was brilliant. And I grew up in a very affluent town where there was lots going on, but at some point in the late 80s, the beginning of the 90s, it all disappeared thanks to Margaret Thatcher, and obviously we know the close of the mining and steel industry and all the rest of it. But surely if there was enough will there across Europe to instill some social responsibility to these, do you not feel that could be possible? Or even to divert all these misused taxes away from, or unpaid taxes away from that, to develop some sort of social networks to grow like previously with the likes of Rowntree and Cadbury's or Bourneville? Don't you think that could happen?
But well, it could only happen if one got a completely different kind of politician, a sort of politician who didn't spend $500,000 digging out his moat. It's quite easy. The sort of people who become politicians are not the sort of people who, despite their protestations, are liable to help anyone but themselves.
And we're just moving the mic round. And it's fluttering, it's landed.
Yeah. You said you'd do a couple more documentaries and that would be it. Is that just with the BBC, or no more documentaries, full stop?
Oh, I don't know. I'm writing a book. I'm enjoying it very much. It's unbelievably sordid. And I'm kind of happy doing that till someone comes along and waves enough money at me to do something else. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, Well, thank you to the most voracious sump of Dreiberg of them all, and thank you to our audience today. And yes, you're all very welcome. Is there someone I should be handing over to now?